Welcome to our webinar today. We're very excited to see you all. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to join and then we'll get started. So if you would like to grab a quick cup of coffee, you've probably got a minute and a half to do so. Otherwise, we'll get started shortly. Lovely to see so many people coming into the waiting room and joining us for today. Just to give you a quick idea of how it's going to work, you should have access to a Q&A or a chat function. So if there's anything you'd like to ask during the session, please feel free to drop it in there and we'll make sure we get to it at the end if we can. Otherwise, we'll email you our feedback at the end if we run out of time. We expect it to be quite a full session, so we'll get through the slides with as much clarity and comprehensiveness as we can, and then we'll get on to answering everyone's questions at the end. So please do drop those into our chat and we'll get those to you. Just give it a couple more minutes. Great, let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to talk about fixing the what's on experience, and Connor has a lot of experience in this particular realm, so I know we'll all benefit from his wisdom and his insight. But before we get started, I thought I'd just give you a little introduction to who we are. Connor is our host today. He's leading this conversation. He's the design director at Chaptr, and I'm director of client partnerships. So if you ever want to work with us, I'll probably be the person you're speaking to, and we can talk about your strategy and whatever it is that you need. And we are part of the team that runs Chaptr, which is a sort of boutique design agency, but we actually specialize in so much more than that. We help theatres and festivals, ensembles, and cultural organizations to understand what their websites really need to do, and then to define, design, and deliver those with clarity, with care, and with purpose. So it's so much more than just translating your vision into something beautiful and visual. It's actually making sense of the strategy behind it, who you're trying to reach, and what they need from you. And that's part of what we want to talk about today. We've noticed that while we build websites that we like to say build audiences, often getting people to your website is only the beginning. And from there, people need to really engage with what you're offering. And that's what we'd like to talk about today. There's a gap sometimes between people finding you and people really taking advantage of everything that you offer and the good that you're putting out into the world. So I'd love to hand over to Connor now so he can tell you more about just filling that gap between discovery and booking and what a really excellent What's On journey looks like. Over to you, Connor.
Hi everyone, I'm Connor Gosh. I'm design director at Chaptr. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. So as Vanessa said, today's session is called From Discovery to Booking, and it's all about fixing what we call the what's on experience. Now, when we talk about a website's performance, we tend to find that organizations focus on an individual piece of the what's on journey. They might focus on the listings or the event page themselves, or maybe the ticketing system. But our audiences don't experience these things separately. They experience one journey, and a journey that starts with discovery and ends with making a booking. And along that journey, every point of friction creates an opportunity for people to drop away. And so something that I want you to think about as we move through this talk is this statement that organizations that succeed online are the ones that reduce friction throughout the journey from discovery to booking. And today we'll look at where that friction appears and why it happens. And sprinkled throughout, there'll be many sort of practical steps that you can implement to help reduce this friction. And to just give you a bit of an overview of the agenda, we'll start off by talking about why audiences struggle online. We'll talk about where friction appears on this journey. We'll talk about a concept that we use internally called time to clarity. And at the end, we'll talk about some practical improvements that can be made immediately. But throughout, as I said, throughout this talk, there'll be many helpful bits of guidance and advice to improve. So a really core concept that I want you to think about is curiosity, confidence, and attendance. The goal of this talk isn't to simply help you publish an event, it's to help you create a digital experience that turns your users' curiosity into value. and helps them build confidence and trust, which is a really core part of what we want to talk about, which ultimately leads to the final step, and that is the decision to actually attend. And one of the main areas or issues with this is the friction along this curiosity to attendance journey. And so to understand where this friction appears, first we need to understand how audiences actually behave online. So first of all, I want to talk about audiences' expectations have changed over recent years. And I'm sure this is something we all know in the social media age. I'm not going to say anything revolutionary here. But we know at the moment in this current economic climate that audiences are increasingly cautious with their time and with their money. Often people who are willing to spend want the confidence that the experience that they are going to get is worthwhile. And a user of the site will base the value on a number of factors. And of course, you might have a really good program, a really good event, and that in itself may have lots of value. But if the quality of that program and that event isn't communicated well online, then that value isn't being transmitted to the user and they aren't able to build that trust. And so the quality of the in-person experience should be reflected online. And when evaluating an event, audiences want to know what it is. Is it for them? Is it worth their while? And I think most importantly of all is, can they trust this experience? And the expectations of their experiences are perhaps sadly set elsewhere. In the day of streaming and endless amounts of content online, our expectations of what a digital experience should look like is shaped by things such as streaming platforms, your Netflix, your Spotify, your Amazons, platforms where there is endless amounts of content with great visuals that are there at a swipe of a finger or a click of a button. These platforms, and I use these platforms as an example because they make discovery really easy. They help users to understand value really quickly, and most of all, they reduce the effort and uncertainty that users have. And I don't want to add offence by comparing the amazing organisations across the arts and culture sector to a simple streaming platform. But I use it as an example of an experience that users come to expect these days, and ultimately what we're competing with in the arts and culture sector. And this leads me on to the emotional challenge. And when I say the emotional challenge, that's looking internally at ourselves. If we produce a show or an event or an exhibition, we're passionate about that. We've invested a lot of time and a lot of heart and a lot of energy to that. And teams in this sector are they're often overworked and they have small teams and small budgets a lot of the time, and they invest a lot emotionally into the work that they produce. And this is amazing, and it leads to some really incredible work that we see in this sector. But what it can also present is somewhat of a challenge in communicating to people who aren't part of that inner circle. And what we sometimes see is internal language appears when we represent ourselves online that can cause confusion. It can lead to context being assumed that just because I know what I'm talking about or I know my event doesn't necessarily mean that my audience does. Sometimes we can maybe overdo it with the information that we provide, endless amounts of copy and text to describe the amazing performance or show that we're putting on, but that leads to the practical information being buried. And a common thing we see is the event artwork actually becoming a bit of a hindrance when it's overlaid with text or cropped awfully. It can just really cheapen that experience, but we use it incorrectly because we've invested so much into creating the visuals that support our production or our program. What our users really want to see is clarity, relevance, and confidence. Just to go back to those points again. The challenge here is to demonstrate value and provide key information to an audience that expects efficiency and ease. And if the audiences have to work hard to understand something, many simply won't continue. And that's what connects these last few slides. It's an experience that is quick and easy to use and feels similar to what our audiences use every day. and making sure that we're able to put our heads above the emotion that we put into our work and actually create something that outwardly reflects an experience that the user wants to see. But in a practical sense, discovery has changed as well. Once upon a time, we could probably assume that users would land on our homepage. We put a lot of effort and time into our homepage. It directs traffic to all different areas of the site. But the reality is that people arrive from a Google search, from social media, maybe a blog post, even just a link shared between friends over text, just saying, "Hey, have you seen this show? Let's go and check it out." And so the chances are that a lot of the time, users won't actually be joining our site for the first time on the homepage. They may land straight on an event page. They may land on our What's On page where everything is displayed at once. And so the key message from this is every part along the What's On journey has to perform. It has to have the right language. It has to have the right visuals. It has to have our best foot forward. Because ultimately, and to go back to that point of trust, if a user lands on the site for the first time, at some point in that booking journey that you haven't maybe put the time into, or maybe you thought they aren't going to land on, and that first impression is weak, then that's going to diminish that trust and turn users away and reduce your conversions. So when we talk about friction along this booking journey, where does friction actually appear? So the first point, I want to talk about 5 really common errors that we see when constructing a What's On journey. And the first one of this actually starts not on the front side of the site, but actually in the back end, and it's poor CMS foundations. Many audiences face problems well before the visitor actually reaches the site. They're often created by the systems and the processes used to publish the content. Quite often we see events that are set up quite poorly, or when we're on one website, multiple events are set up in a really different way. We see duplicate data entry where pieces of content are repeated, or maybe even whole events are repeated. We see weak taxonomies where events are categorized in a little bit of an odd way, or maybe different owners of the web contributors to the website are adding same categories, but maybe not in the same way. So actually similar events are linked but can't be connected to one another because the taxonomies we set in the back end actually aren't clear and aren't consistent. That's similar to unclear ownership, where we know naturally small teams, maybe many contributors to the website, and everyone's kind of got their own perception about how it should read or how it should appear. But when there's no ownership and no governance over the website, it actually leads to a bit of a mess. I've touched on previously on poor image management, where images are cropped poorly, or we have event artwork and there's text over the top, and that's actually being cropped off the screen because there aren't defined aspect ratios or preset orientations for landscape and portrait mode. And just a bit of a flimsy CMS. And what I mean by that is a CMS that's maybe outdated, a CMS that has lots of plugins that aren't up to date, so become a security risk. And just a CMS that isn't locked in place well enough, that allows all of the above to be easily edited and created, leading to ultimately a whole system that feels insecure, weak, and really, really inconsistent. So some practical improvements would be to create a publishing template. Have a preset template for each of your events. That doesn't mean you have to be really rigid and really boring on each one, but having predefined fields in the back end that mean anyone can come on, follow it like an instruction manual, and your events remain consistent. Define the mandatory event fields, similar to this, but have fields within these event templates that mean that they have to be filled in before an event is published, like the date, like the description, like a header image, something like that. So if these things aren't filled in, that event can't be published, and you aren't left with event programs that are missing key information. Plan taxonomies ahead. Have a strategy. Have a category naming system that everybody across the organisation can follow. Keep this simple and keep this clear, because if you can't understand it or it's being used in different ways across your team, then your audiences definitely aren't going to understand it. Have standardised image formats. good quality, but not too heavy, so that it's not weighing down the site. And think about how the images are going to be cropped across mobile and desktop devices. Have an agreed ownership and governance plan. Sometimes a lot of CMSs allow you to lock down and restrict certain features, meaning that only well-trained people or people in the know can contribute properly. And then implement best CMS best practices as well. Keep your plugins up to date. Assess, is this CMS right for me? Is it doing everything that I need it to do? If it's slow, if it's bogging you down, maybe it's time for a change. The next problem is too much choice and not enough guidance. So when an audience encounters large volume of undifferentiated content, the effort required to choose increases dramatically. And so this is a key point of effort. When we have huge undifferentiated grids, maybe we have calendars with just events all marked and styled exactly the same. If we have event cards all look really identical and no hierarchy, everything kind of just merges into one, and we're met with kind of just not knowing where to click. It's that thing of when everything's there and everything's the same, ultimately everything then becomes diluted and it loses a lot of impact. We're overwhelmed, and ultimately we're left to making too much indecision. So the role of the what's on section is to not just present choice, it's to support the decision making. And I've used a screenshot of the John Hansau Gallery website, which is a site that we worked on, where we introduced a featured hero section. And I know there's a little bit of controversy about having sliders in the hero section, but we felt leading with big visuals right at the start and those being featured, predetermined select handful of events meant that users were instantly able to see, the events that you prioritize and you want to factor in. They are met with a choice that's somewhat made for them, but we're talking about curation here rather than just overwhelming. And I think that's the key to when we are curating our events, providing something leading and hand holding to a degree, whilst encouraging that element of organic exploration. So ultimately, rather than presenting everything equally, organizations should think about how they can actively guide discovery. You can think about having trending events, staff recommendations, maybe family-friendly collections, or even seasonal highlights. Sometimes, we have our day-to-day events that are there, I said, every single day, but we also have maybe some high-ticket items which, are bringing in the money, and those things we want to feature more. So rather than just having a what's on page with endless amounts of listings that all look the same, think about creating collections, think about creating featured events, making it visual, making it stand out, and creating more of a curation for our users rather than just something that looks exactly the same. And restricted discovery. You have to think about how users are actually discovering the content. Are they working too hard? And we have to think about this particularly across mobile devices as well. Quite often we see a what's on feed on a mobile where it's just endless amounts of scrolling through cards and cards and cards because everything's stacked on top of each other, and it actually makes discovery a real pain. Audiences arrive with curiosity, with partial interest, and sometimes they know where they want to get to as well. So we need to cater for these different audience types. If I'm somebody who comes onto the site and just wants to explore organically, maybe I don't know what I want to see. Maybe I don't know exactly what you do, but I just want to explore in an organic, free manner. These people need to be catered for in the same way that somebody who knows what they want to see, they just want to book and get to where they want to get to quickly. And this is possible to do this, but it's all about creating really clear and concise user journeys and creating signposts along those journeys that make it easy to follow and understand. Audiences can only find events if they already know what they're looking for, and if they all understand your organization structure, they don't want to browse through rigid categories. Good discovery experiences create opportunities for exploration. What you can think about is this example here on the right hand side, for example, is from the Barbican's website. Rather than just having on the homepage, just here's everything that's on to do at one time. It's what's on this week or 3 things to do, and I think that's a really cool way of just bringing events to the fore that may not necessarily be there, or allowing for that organic discovery where maybe I'm just I'm not sure what's on at the Barbican this week, or maybe I've got an hour and don't want to spend loads of money, and already within one click of a button or with just one scroll down the page, I'm able to discover something that I didn't know was already there. And if I come on to the next slide, this is from our work from the Lyric Theatre. Another great way of doing this is when you come to the end of your events page, an particular event page, having things like related events, or you may also like. If a user comes onto an event and maybe it's not for them, don't allow them to drop off. Don't allow them to just click away from the page. Have suggested events, create those circular routes across your website, and keep users clicking, keep users engaged. Another thing we see that causes a lot of friction is the actual disconnected booking part of it. And a really key piece, a really key statement in this is even highly motivated visitors can abandon a purchase if the process suddenly feels unfamiliar and complicated. The key to all of this is trust and momentum. People want to feel the confidence that when they book something, they feel trusted and it feels familiar. One of the some issues that we see with this is when a user goes onto a ticketing platform and all of a sudden the styling and the branding looks completely different. There's repeated steps, maybe they've gone through and selected the tickets that they want on the actual main part of the site, yet when they've gone onto the ticketing platform, they're repeating those steps again. They're left questioning, hang on, is that actually useful for me and what I want to do? Maybe the buttons used aren't clear. It just says next or next step or something random and not very motivating like that. And maybe they're left guessing, maybe they have accessibility needs or want to know key pieces of information. And if they're on the seat map, for example, and they're thinking, well, hang on, what's right for me? Where do I click? Where do I sit? And that whole part just feels more complicated. We lose momentum and we lose trust, and this causes users to step away. So some practical improvements for this. Maintain visual consistency. Unfortunately, some ticketing systems are quite limited about how you can style them. We know that they can be quite rigid and difficult. It's a consistent pain. However, look for ways to maybe implement like an API or work with a developer to try and style that ticketing system as closely as possible to your main site. So when the user steps from your site to completing the ticketing process, that change feels consistent. It feels trustworthy. Improve button clarity, visually and contextually. Are buttons clear? Are buttons easy to click? Are they responsive? And most importantly, I think, is the text within those buttons. Don't just have next or learn more. Tell the users what the next step is. Make that next step on the journey predictable and easy to understand. Reduce unnecessary steps. Nobody wants repetitions along that process. And provide reassurance throughout the process as well. Have progress indicators. Tell audiences what they can expect on the next thing. If they're filling out a form and they've entered a field, have that form feedback turn green. Let them know that they've done that right in a live manner, rather than just getting to the end of the form, they filled out all their details, and all of a sudden there's an error and they're left annoyed. Make seating maps clear. Think about accessibility. Think about access needs, and introduce digital wallet payments where possible. People love Apple Pay, Google Pay, and if there's a way to include those, let's use it because it makes it trustworthy and it makes it quick. And then lastly is the event pages themselves. Some common issues that we see is long passages of text that make it quite hard to understand. Obviously, we're passionate about the events and the programs that we put on, but do often find there's a nice middle ground between describing it and delivering some really great content and perhaps overdoing it. Ultimately, what people want to see is the main thing, the main information, the runtime. Is it for them? When is it on? Those key things. And if those are buried amongst long copy, then that's going to create more frustration and more friction. Missing accessibility information and no social proof as well. I mean, obviously, users can take your word for it that what you're putting on is great, but think about things such as reviews, testimonials, and other little snippets like, maybe there's a cast, maybe there's a get to know the actor, maybe there's behind the scenes access. All these little things that you could include to make the experience feel more personable and make it more like the real life experience, because it's just going to enhance the experience for the user on the website. And something to consider with event pages in particular is on the mobile experience as well. Obviously, if we're on desktop, we can have copy on one side and the book now button on another side, and everything's displayed nice and clearly. But on the mobile, everything becomes stacked. And actually, then you have to really think about the order that your content is appearing. Because if you have, the image at the top, all the content in the middle, but actually, the runtime and the date and the book now button is at the very bottom, the user's scrolling for too long to get there, and it becomes more of a frustration. And another thing to consider as well is, do you have an over reliance on hover states and interaction to convey your information? Because those things may not necessarily be as obvious on mobile. And also for accessibility needs as well. If somebody's using a screen reader, then if you have accordions or content buried behind interactions or buried behind an area where someone has to click to unveil that information, then that's just going to make it more complicated, and it's not the most accessibility friendly practice. So that leads me on to our internal concept of time to clarity. Time to clarity is how long it takes a visitor to understand what something is and why it matters and what they should do next. Every second of confusion increases the likelihood of a drop-off, and this is why time to clarity is really important. A really key theme to this is momentum, or booking momentum. When a user has a flow and there's trust in that flow, they're more likely to complete the booking. But every little piece of friction or everything that just increases their time reduces that momentum, it reduces that trust, and ultimately it creates hesitation. And I'm just going to put back on screen again one of the slides that we opened with: curiosity, confidence, and attendance. Strong journeys maintain momentum through this process. Weak journeys interrupt this process, interrupt momentum. Something you can try is the 5-second test. If somebody lands on an event page, in the first 5 seconds, can they tell what the event is? Can they tell who it's for? Can they understand when it happens? And do they know how to book? Is that call to action really clear? Can they click that button quickly? If not, chances are time to clarity is too high, and you're reducing that momentum and you're increasing that friction. And this isn't about simplifying the culture. What I don't want to come across as is just simply saying, get from users from A to B really quick, or produce the content or your really well thought content on your production pages and just make it quick, make it easy, because it's not about that necessarily. Because if your productions and your events are well thought out and there's a lot of love and heart that have gone into those, then you want that content to be there online. So by no means am I saying simplify the culture or dumb down your offering, but it's about thinking how that content and how that format can be reflected online in a way that makes it really easy for a user to understand. It's about reducing barriers. It's about thinking about accessibility, increasing participation, and again, that really key thing is building trust. And again, I'll repeat, is when information is easy to find, organizations find themselves more trustworthy. So have your amazing content, but within that, think about the journey and think about how users can get from A to B within that content and not getting bogged down by it. Of course, this all has to work within real organisation constraints. And I've worked in the sector long enough, and I've worked with enough arts and cultures organisations to know that things aren't always easy, and there are a lot of factors that play into making our day-to-day lives really, really difficult. Often there's small teams. I've spoken about the CMS, and we have legacy systems that are old and outdated and make things hard to use. There's always limited budgets that are stretched across different areas of the organization. There's multiple stakeholders, somebody from, the creative director is going to have the very different agendas and priorities from the marketing team or the box office team, for example. So there's often competing stakeholders that have different ideas. And some organizations have really complex programming as well. Different events, different categories, different target audiences, all pulling the organisation in different directions, all with different needs. So I do completely sympathise with the operational reality that exists for arts and culture organisations, and this is often sorry, a good UX isn't a good user experience on the front end is not just a design problem. It often stems from issues within governance and issues within a content workflow and issues with the system itself. Something that we've come across quite often, or a particular evidence of this is, for example, a member from the box office team calls about a user that wants to know something that could be just demonstrated on the FAQs page. Maybe that instead of calling the box office team and asking, can I book a ticket for this show? Maybe they're asking, what's parking going to be like? What are your opening hours? Can I get food at the venue? Which is practical information, and it's obviously great to help those people. But if that's blocking the line for somebody looking to call and make a valuable booking, or if you maybe have a really under pressure box office team that are a couple of people trying to sell a whole show, and actually they're answering questions about that, that's not doing your internal team any good, and it's not the most efficient way of working. So thinking actually beyond the booking system for a moment, is your whole site delivering what it needs to deliver? Is the content there in the right place? Are your FAQs there? Are valuable information about planning a visit, is that in the right place? Because if users are trying hard to find that information and having to call the box office team, for example, then that's an issue. And every avoidable inquiry represents staff time, operational cost, and ultimately lost confidence. Because if I can't come onto your site and just even know what your opening hours are or how to get to you, and I'm having to make that call, then that doesn't fill me with confidence that your programming is worth my time and worth my money. So the best of what's on experiences usually come from operational clarity and not visual design alone. So I just want to talk about some practical improvements you can make. I know I covered a few of these when we went through the regular problems that we see, but I just thought I'd go through a few just general, really quick improvements you can maybe even go away today and make right away. And something that I want to stress here is progress over perfection. When we discuss the digital experiences, there can be a temptation to assume that the solution is a major redesign. Maybe it's a multiple £1,000 project to start from scratch and rip everything up and start again. But I do want to stress that it doesn't always have to be that case, and there are quick wins that we can make instantly to make progress. And like I said, the key thing here is progress over perfection, or progress over time to hopefully reach that point of perfection. And so the first step would just to be simply to audit your event pages. You can start by picking sort of 3 or 5 events and go back to some of the things that we discussed on this talk. Is the proposition clear? Is the information easy to find? Is the accessibility information visible? And is the booking action obvious? What you can do is potentially create a graph and score these actions 1 to 5 and color code these, and create a visual representation of what your event pages actually look like. If 1's the easiest to achieve and 5's the hardest to achieve, and we color that green to red, are we seeing more red and high numbers, or are we seeing more green and low numbers? What you could do is send out your event pages to friends and family and ask for their honest opinions. Run these kind of usability tests. There's 3 ways of doing them, and just be honest and critical of your event pages and ask, is everything that our user needs there and clear and obvious from minute 1? Review timed clarity. Can somebody immediately identify what an event is and who it's for and when it happens and what to do next? And it's kind of similar to auditing the event page, but treat this as part of the whole what's on journey. When I land on the homepage, is this instantly kicking off the journey for me? If I've landed straight onto an event page, or maybe your full what's on page, is it clear what I need to click on? Is everything being presented to me with equal hierarchy, and so I'm not knowing where to click or where to choose? Is that balance there? And think about your time to clarity, and ultimately that key number is 5 seconds. And it doesn't mean we have to rush our users, but if the users don't understand what's there within those first 5 seconds and it's not immediately clear what their next action is in that 5 seconds, the momentum's lost and we create that friction. So review that, get the stopwatch out, land on different parts of your site, send that out to other people, ask a question. Hey, what do you think of this page? Is it clear? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if the answer is no, then your time to clarity is probably too long. Improve discovery pathways, and this is something we touched on earlier, but think about how we're helping people explore. The key thing here is, are we helping our people to explore, or are we simply just displaying information? At the event, at the end of your event pages, how about including a related events or an indicator for the next step? Maybe there's seasonal themes you could have. You know, when winter comes around, are there festive events that you have? Are there summer events that you have? Are there collections that you have that link together? You know, think about your categorization, think about your tagging systems, thinking about how we can ultimately treat users as individuals and curate what we offer to suit individual people. And this, you know, this doesn't need complex algorithms necessarily. This doesn't need huge investments. It's just about thinking about our taxonomies and reviewing our key pages along this journey and thinking about actually, are we able to hold their hand? Are we able to give guidance? Or are we just simply splatting out everything on a page like an overly complicated calendar and thinking go wild? Because ultimately, I don't think that curates the best journeys for our users. And I've crossed out prioritize mobile because I personally always think that mobile first is a bit outdated. I think ultimately, yes, we know probably the majority of our audiences come through mobile or use mobile nowadays, and that number's probably only going to increase. But I think mobile first is limiting. It just doesn't cut it anymore. I think the whole experience across desktop and mobile, tablet, the whole device, I think users are expecting that to be flawless across all of it now. But what I did want to focus on for mobile is optimizing the mobile experience. And it goes back to the comment that I made around our event pages and how that content stacks for mobile. Think about that whole journey on mobile. If we are using filtering and tagging, what does that filter look like? Is that filter actually becoming a hindrance rather than a help if again the user's having to scroll and scroll and scroll? If we have a beautiful artwork produced that is landscape and it's got text over the top, yet when it comes onto mobile, it's cropping and we're losing the edges and text is cropped off, and immediately it's cheapening our event page because we've got some awful cropping. All these things are worth thinking about and considering, and also thinking about readability as well. Are our text sizes and is our content hitting accessibility standards on mobile? Because if users are having to zoom in or squint or bring the phone to their face, then again, that's not a helpful experience and only creates more friction. And focusing on consistency. I spoke about creating templates for your event pages. So whether it's the brand new junior intern that's only just joined, they can come onto the CMS and they can create an event because there's a template and there's a structure in place. Imagery that feels coherent. Have you got styles? Is there a kind of a set image bank or image library that you can use? Do you know how to use your imagery? So subjects are placed in the middle and aren't being cropped out of the side. Can you document your content standards? Do you have a tone of voice? Is there a way of speaking about yourself? Again, it becomes quite difficult when there are multiple contributors to the site, but brand and brand goes beyond our visual representation on screen. It's how we speak about ourselves. It's our confidence. It's our passion. And although we all have unique ways of writing and unique ways of speaking, it does help to have standards that are documented and are clear. And this also stretches to the branding and the visual side of branding as well. You know, do you have brand guidelines? If I'm creating a social media asset, is it clear that I should use this font or this color in this way? Because you know, quite often we see a website that's designed one way, but somebody's Instagram looks completely different or just looks a bit of a mess. And not everybody has to be graphic designers, but if the documentation is in place and there's clear language guidance and clear visual guidance, then that helps to keep things consistent across a whole organization. And lastly, the publishing workflows are clear. When we're creating a new event, or publishing something new, who needs sign off on it? Who needs to contribute? Who's doing the double checks to make it clear? And then just having these workflows known and locked down and consistent across an organization really helps to create our events and our programming consistent and clear and ultimately error free. So to close, I'd like to leave you with a final thought. Ultimately, fixing the what's on experience isn't about creating a better calendar or an archive of events that all sit on one page in the same way. It's about creating a better journey, and a journey that helps audiences move from discovery to understanding and feeling confidence and trust, to actually making that booking. Every part of the What's On experiences has a single job, helping audiences move from curiosity to confidence. And the easier that journey feels, the more likely the people are to attend. And again, just to stress that it's not about dumbing down what you do or saying that your performance pages have to be a couple of lines long and that content is hidden. But it's about thinking about the journey on a whole. And amongst that beautiful content, amongst that amazing value that you offer, is a user actually able to interact with it in a way that that value is demonstrated, and that trust is built. We've spoken about trust, we've spoken about momentum, we've spoken about reducing friction and hesitation, and all of these things combine to make a what's on journey that feels cohesive, that feels easy to understand. And if the momentum is there and if the trust is there, then your work and your productions will speak for themselves, and ultimately you'll see bookings increase. So I'll open the floor now to any questions that anybody has. I hope that was helpful. I hope that gave some guidance. But yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Connor. That was really good. So yeah, drop your questions into the chat if you have any. This is exactly what Chaptr does, the work that Connor's been describing. We work with arts and culture organizations on exactly these kinds of challenges. So if any of this resonates with you, we'd love to continue the conversation. You're welcome to contact us for an audit of your current journey, or we can investigate what your event pages look like on mobile and how they perform. We can review your time to clarity. And we can think from an audience perspective, because since we're not part of your organization, we can partner with you as external voices of perspective and insight. So yeah, just give us a shout. But before we move on to that, we would just love to hear if anyone's got any thoughts or questions or just feedback in general on anything that Connor shared today. And just to note, we will be sharing the recording of this presentation afterwards as well. Great, thanks, Alex. So, Connor, Alex is asking, have you done any benchmarking on the length of video content that we should be considering on our websites? That's a great question.
Yeah, so there's two factors to there's a few factors to consider here. It's often about placement and where the video content is going to go. If it's, for example, going to be in like a hero section or going to be somewhere at the top of the page, like the home page, for example, then you have to consider how long the user's going to spend on that part of the site, and also how long we actually want them to spend on their site or that part of the site, because video there is a really good, it's eye-catching, it's engaging, and it's great. But there has to be an action that's taken at the end of that. We don't want somebody to just sit on a 30-second video and think, oh, that looks great, and kind of get a bit bogged down there and lose track of what they're going to do. We want to think about what the call to action is or what the next step is on that part. So short and sweet. I don't have an exact should be 5 seconds or something like that, but short and sweet. And maybe think about longer content on your production pages if you have things like cast interviews or behind the scenes footage and things like that. Then there's place for kind of longer form content deeper in that journey, where maybe somebody's got far enough along that journey where they want to uncover more context and they want to see things a bit deeper. Maybe if you have a general kind of show reel or something that's a bit longer form, then maybe that can sit on the about page or somewhere further down that pathway where somebody is probably more inclined to look at that if they found themselves in your about page. And that doesn't mean to say that, like I said, a hero video or something like that on the homepage isn't impactful, because it certainly is. But I'd say for that setting, then something short and sweet. Um, and obviously then as well to think about file size as well, because when we think about video, naturally big file sizes, the larger file size, the more it's going to slow performance, affect SEO, affect the user experience. So the balance is finding a video file that's not so long that the file's massive, or too short and too much of a small file size that it becomes grainy and pixelated. It's probably something short to a good quality, so the file size keeps low, performance is good, and then something longer form can go somewhere else on the site.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Connor. I hope that answered your question, Alex. So we also have a question about mobile performance. So you've said not to prioritize mobile, but to optimize for mobile. Can you just maybe expand that a little bit more and sort of talk through your view on mobile devices and how they compare to desktop and other screens, and what we should be thinking about with those?
Yeah, so I guess I hope I didn't come across as too misleading when I said not to prioritize. It was more of a way of not saying I personally don't like the whole mobile first approach. It's more of a way of saying collectively the experience that your user has, whether they're on the desktop and whether they're on mobile. To me, I think it should be equal, and it should offer the same value. So not mobile first, but mobile optimized, or whole system optimized, I should say. But yeah, the studies show that audiences are accessing mostly on mobile at the moment, so it is essential that we are designing for that. And I think sometimes, or what I've come across in the past, is a website is designed desktop first, and the mobile experiences just becomes a reflection of what's on desktop, but stacked. When I say stacked, I mean when there's a layout on desktop that we're able to produce in a landscape format where everything's perhaps higher up the page and sits nicely side by side, translates to mobile as a stacking process. And because we've suddenly become portrait. And what that means is, if I take a what's on page, for example, where on a what's on page on desktop, we may have our content to one side and then a really clear book now button on the right hand side with your date and the location and all that key information. If that then on mobile has to become stacked because we can't squeeze it all in side by side, then what may happen is that all that valuable information and all that really, that call to action that says book, that suddenly becomes lost down the bottom of the page, which could be multiple scrolls down and down and down, and that's just frustrating and annoying. So when I say mobile optimized, it's kind of ensuring that your website design and development isn't just are we going to start with one sort of screen proportion and just let the rest follow? It's like, here's a separate design for desktop, and it's optimized and performed for the orientation that users browse when they're on the laptop or when they're sat at their computers. And that, in a way, is almost separate from the design and the experiences on mobile, because the way we interact with that and the way that it appears and is represented is completely different. And so it's about thinking about the overall process but how that process is experienced on different screen sizes, and not letting one just follow the other, but actually optimizing across those different screen sizes. And I really hope that wasn't a waffly or rambly way of answering your question. If there's something specific that I've missed there, then please let me know.
I think that covers it. Thank you. So it's more about thinking about the whole journey and ideally getting someone external to have a look at all the touch points on that journey. And we've got a couple of really good questions that have just come through. The first one is, would it be fair to say, or in your opinion, do you think it's true that the What's on page now in the modern sort of web of 2026 does what the homepage used to do, and how we think about our homepages maybe needs to evolve?
No, not necessarily. I personally don't think that. Um, and I think that's especially the case for a lot live event organisations, because whilst selling tickets and the what's on journey, and we discussed, is really, really, really important, I did also touch upon the bit about FAQs and valuable information, and planning a visit, and other information that is really important alongside selling events. a lot of arts and cultures organisations as well rely on donations and support, things like memberships and other areas like that that don't we don't necessarily want to compete with selling tickets, but do have a very valuable place on the site. And so the homepage I find is still vital and really important as a kind of a kicking off point to different areas of the site that still feel important. And the complex thing and the challenges is not overwhelming the user with really complicated homepages. We don't want to stack all of our events on there and have a million links off to different things because that dilutes the impact of what we want users to click on. But homepages still are there to kind of capture the essence of the whole site. We can have a featured feed of events on the homepage, but I think it's still quite important to, if getting donations and memberships is still really valuable for you, then making that apparent and obvious on the homepage is still really useful. And planning the visit, those key area access informations, those things like that. There's a place and a home for that on the homepage, and that's what differentiates a homepage from a what's on page, because what's on, we just really want to focus on events. So the two are highly important and maybe equal in importance in some ways if your main goal is to drive ticket sales. But the what's on page isn't doing what the homepage used to do. They are separate. They are both important as individual assets, but it's also about thinking about what I said about how users discover the website now. They may not land straight on your homepage. They may land directly on the what's on page. So that's why it's important that that what's on page is as good as the homepage and is offering the right information.
Yeah, that's useful. Thanks, Connor. So this is a really great question, and it might kind of expand beyond the scope of our conversation today. But have you thought about how we cultivate an organized community through the main website versus what happens on social channels? And I know a lot of our clients this year are thinking about how to make the sort of Instagram experience or sort of other channels like that, how to replicate that to some degree on the website so that it also becomes a social hub. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I see. Well, I've spoken about brand and brand consistency, and it's important that we have synergy for our visual and written communications to be consistent across all of our platforms, whether that's the website, but also our social platforms being an extension of that has consistency. Um, Quite often, a really good kind of tool for marketing and SEO is thought leadership. And what we may often see is organizations creating hubs or insights pages where they're able to populate it with content, be that written content, visual content, and allowing that content to be shared and promoted online. And then that content in itself um, relating back to areas of the site. An example being if a production has just gone live, can that production be supported by social media posts or blog posts to give behind the scenes access? And that doesn't have to conflict or compete with the ticket booking process, but maybe there's an insights page on the site that links to that event page, and then suddenly if that blog post is shared on social media, that's just another route into the site. And so it's about creating those routes and creating those channels, and all of that's good for SEO as well, and just is another way of discovery other than just here's my event. It's, well, you know what, if I've shared a blog post on LinkedIn, or I've got a reel on Instagram, a little bit of behind the scenes access, and if that gets picked up, if that draws a bit of an attention and somebody can click through to an event page, then that's another channel in, and I think that's a positive.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm conscious that we're coming up to time, so we've just got a couple more questions that I'll try and get through. Otherwise, we'll reply to people directly with our answers. But how would you prioritize improvements if an arts organization can only fix, say, three things this quarter? And what, if anything, do you think would give the fastest lift in bookings?
Good question. So when I touched upon the quick wins earlier, I would say do a little bit of usability testing on your events pages and on the journey that we've spoken about. Usability testing can be really, really simple, and it can be completely free as well. I would avoid doing sort of things like usability testing internally because we can be affected by our own bias. But if there are friends and family and just general people we can share certain tests with, then that can often recreate good results. And an example of this, as I said, would be take your event pages, take 4 or 5 of them to start, and run the 5 second test that we spoke about. Test it, view it on mobile, view it on desktop side by side, and evaluate that performance. Is it clear within 5 seconds? What it is, and the key information. Check that. Apply the same logic and the same theory to the what's on page and the different steps along that what's on journey. And just to go back to the particular test that I mentioned, I can't remember the name of the graph off the top of my head. It escapes me. But create a visual diagram, and write questions and say, how easy is to click book now? How easy is it to find accessibility information? How easy is it to understand the runtime? Ask your users to rank that experience from 1 to 5, and then suddenly you can build a kind of a real visual and data-led response to your website that isn't affected by maybe your own bias or your own assumption, because sort of there's no better feedback than getting the feedback of your users, or if they're not there, then sort of friends and family, and over time you can build a picture. But I would start there. I do think the ticket booking part, when you move onto your ticketing system, whether it's sort of like Spectrix or TicketSolve or sort of something like that, if that has quite a big impact, if that experience is rubbish, then it really reduces trust, and it creates quite a lot of drop-offs. But I'd
Mm.
say that side of things is a little bit more of like, you may need a developer for that, or you may need to contact your ticket system support team, and so that might be slightly less of a quick win. But if there are ways around that, and you can implement ways of making that sort of ticket system exchange a lot smoother, then I tend to find that has quite a big impact, and that builds a lot of trust as well. So yeah, like I said, we will be sharing the recording of this and this deck as well, so you can go back through some of my practical ways of making some improvements. And I think anything that we've discussed here, thinking about mobile, thinking about those discovery pathways, would be really helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. I think this is the last question we have time for, but how do you balance making event pages clearer and shorter without losing the artistic voice or the depth of the work?
Definitely. So this is a really important point, and a really one I just do want to stress that it's not necessarily about making it shorter, but it is about making it clearer. I actually think production pages that have lots of good content on them are really helpful. Like, I love it when I see a production page and there's cast headshots, or the testimonials, and or behind the scenes access, and if there is a description that's quite long, I don't necessarily see that as being too much of a problem if that description is purposeful and meaningful, and really helps to sell the production. I think that's great. Um, but what the balance is presenting that and laying that out in a way that doesn't compete with the key information and the key journey. Because what you don't want to do is be bogged down in the extra nice stuff in a way, and not actually be able to get to the what I need. So
Mm.
yeah, I don't want the culture to be dumbed down. I don't want people to just bypass the production pages. There's a lot of heart and a lot of time that have gone into them. But what I do want is for that balance to be found, where if I do just want to get on and book and get going and know what I need to know, then I can do that really easily. And so the way to think about that is how the page is laid out, how content is formatted. We spoke about setting up event templates, so each of your events, whilst unique and individual, can follow a set pattern and routine. So if I'm browsing the site, the events that I look at, although the content's different, there's predictability in what I see. And when that kind of structure and flow is predictable, that builds trust and ultimately has a greater impact.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Connor. We've had some really interesting questions around the theme of how many of these problems can be attributed to sort of UX and user experience, or that side of website use, or whether some of them turn out to be content or organizational problems. So I'd encourage all of our guests to watch our blog. We'll have an article on that coming out soon, which can just help clarify where some of these problems lie and some ideas that we might have on how to solve those. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been really great to spend this time together and talk about something that we're so passionate about at Chaptr, which is getting that what's on page ideal. So, as I said before, if you'd like us to audit your journey, test any of your event pages, review your time to clarity, or just think from an audience perspective, please do reach out for a free 30-minute consultation. You can email me or Connor, or ideally speak to joe.perkins@chaptr.studio, and we'll get some time booked in and go through your site from a user perspective, as well as UX, SEO, and the sort of higher level conversion thinking that goes behind that. If you have any questions or anything else you need, please reach out and we'll get these slides and recording to you as soon as possible. And thanks again for your time today. It's good to see you all.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Cheers.
Bye.